Then I choose her." The words struck the grand hall harder than any royal decree, and for one breathless second, even the chandeliers seemed to stop trembling above the polished marble floor. Duke Ethan Whitmore stood at the center of the court in a black ceremonial coat trimmed with silver, one hand resting on the table where the names of 12 noble women had been arranged in perfect order. He had not looked at the final name. He had not looked at the woman standing beneath it. He had simply pointed toward the far end of the hall, where a young woman in a faded gray cloak stood alone beneath a high stone arch. Her hood covered most of her face. Her gloves were worn. Her boots carried the pale dust of a long road. Around her, silk gowns shimmered, jewels flashed, and whispers sharpened into laughter. Lady Victoria Hale lifted one hand to her lips, but she made no real effort to hide her smile. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sweet enough to disguise the insult. "Surely you do not mean the creature in the corner." More laughter followed, quiet at first, then bold. Ethan's expression did not change. He had returned from 8 years of war to find his future reduced to a parade of beautiful strangers selected by men who cared more about land than loyalty. He had watched the royal council praise perfect posture, perfect bloodlines, and perfect smiles while villages outside the castle struggled to pay winter taxes. So he had made a choice without looking. A protest, he told himself. A refusal to treat marriage like an auction. Yet beneath that noble thought hid another truth he had not admitted, even to himself. He believed the poorest woman in the room would be the easiest to control. "I said I choose her," Ethan repeated. This time, no one laughed. The hooded woman stepped forward. Each footstep echoed through the hall. She did not rush. She did not bow beneath the weight of their stares. When she reached the center aisle, Lady Victoria shifted aside as though poverty itself might stain her gown. Lord Richard Hale, Victoria's father and the most powerful man on Ethan's council, went suddenly still. His eyes dropped to the woman's gloved hand, then to the narrow ceremonial sword at her side. The silver emblem on its hilt had been scratched nearly smooth, but not completely. A crescent moon remained beneath the damage. Richard's face lost its color. Ethan noticed. So did Queen Eleanor, seated beneath the royal crest at the far end of the hall. The queen leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the carved arm of her chair. The hooded woman stopped 6 feet from Ethan. For the first time, he saw the lower half of her face, a steady mouth, a pale scar near her jaw, and no sign of fear. "State your name," Lord Richard ordered. She ignored him. Her attention remained on Ethan. The room waited for gratitude, confusion, perhaps tears. Instead, she spoke in a calm voice that carried to every corner of the court. "Your Grace, you should have looked before you chose." Ethan held her gaze beneath the shadow of the hood. "Why?" She took one final step closer. "Because you have just chosen the woman your council tried to erase." 3 days earlier, before the laughter, before the whispers, and before an entire royal court forgot how to breathe, Clara Bennett arrived at Westmoor Castle in the back of a weathered supply wagon that had traveled nearly 200 miles through autumn rain and mountain roads. The driver never asked her name. He only noticed that she kept her gray hood lowered even when the sun briefly broke through the clouds. Most travelers welcomed warmth after a long journey. Clara turned away from it. As the castle towers rose above the valley, she quietly reached into the worn leather satchel resting against her side and touched a sealed letter wrapped in faded blue ribbon. It had belonged to the woman who had raised her from childhood. Her mother had never called herself brave. She had only said that survival sometimes looked like silence. Before passing away, she had placed the letter into Clara's hands and whispered one final instruction. "Do not let anyone read this except Queen Eleanor. If anyone else asks for it, keep your hood on and walk away." Clara had obeyed those words every single day since. The enormous gates of Westmoor opened just before noon. Merchants, craftsmen, noble families, and servants moved through the crowded courtyard as preparations continued for the royal selection ceremony. Banners carrying the Whitmore crest fluttered above polished stone walls, while musicians rehearsed beneath carved balconies. Every corner of the castle reflected wealth, tradition, and careful order. Clara stepped down from the wagon carrying only her satchel and a simple ceremonial sword whose silver emblem had been worn almost smooth by time. A palace attendant glanced at her faded cloak before directing his attention toward elegantly dressed noble women arriving in polished carriages. "Registration is over there," he said without looking directly at her. Clara thanked him politely. Inside the registration chamber, names were recorded according to noble rank, family title, and regional influence. Lady Victoria Hale entered surrounded by attendants carrying embroidered gowns and jewel cases. Courtiers welcomed her with warm smiles, confident that the daughter of Lord Richard Hale would soon become the next Duchess of Westmoor. Clara quietly waited until the line disappeared. When her turn finally came, the clerk examined her documents with visible disappointment. "No noble escort?" he asked. "No family representative?" Clara gently shook her head. "Only my invitation." The clerk stamped the parchment without another question, then deliberately placed her name at the very bottom of the official list. Lady Victoria watched from across the room and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "How thoughtful," she said softly to the women beside her. "Every grand ceremony deserves one unforgettable mistake." A few nearby ladies laughed. Clara heard every word but offered no reply. She had learned years ago that people often revealed their true character long before they discovered yours. Later that afternoon, she found a quiet corner overlooking the castle gardens and finally opened the small wooden box that had remained untouched throughout the journey. Inside rested an old silver ring engraved with half of a forgotten crest, a folded handkerchief embroidered with the initials A, and a miniature portrait wrapped carefully in linen. Clara unfolded the cloth with steady hands. The painting showed a young woman standing beneath flowering trees, her face gentle, proud, and strangely familiar. Clara stared at the portrait for several long moments before slowly lifting her fingers to her own cheek. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. Hidden beneath the portrait was a single line written in elegant handwriting. "If they recognize your face before they know the truth, they will fear what it means." Clara quietly closed the box, lowered her hood once more, and looked toward the distant towers where the royal court was already gathering, unaware that the greatest secret in the kingdom had just walked through its gates. The same afternoon, while the royal court prepared for the selection ceremony, Duke Ethan Whitmore stood alone inside the western gallery overlooking the castle grounds, watching servants arrange banners, musicians rehearse, and noble families arrive in polished carriages. 8 years away from Westmoor had changed nearly everything except the view from those windows. The forest still stretched toward the horizon. The river still curved around the valley like a silver ribbon. Yet the people beneath him moved differently now. Every greeting carried calculation. Every smile concealed expectation. Every conversation seemed to circle the same subject: marriage. Captain James Carter entered quietly and stopped a respectful distance behind him. "Your Grace," he said, "the council is waiting." Ethan nodded but did not move. "They are not waiting for me," he answered. "They are waiting for my signature." James understood exactly what he meant. Since returning from military service along the northern frontier, Ethan had spent weeks reviewing the financial records of Westmoor. The numbers painted an uncomfortable picture. Harvest taxes had increased year after year while roads, schools, and village markets had received almost no investment. The duchy appeared prosperous inside the castle walls, but the countryside carried the hidden cost of maintaining noble influence. Every report led back to one powerful family, the Hales. Lord Richard Hale had become indispensable during Ethan's absence by financing public projects and extending generous loans to the duchy. Officially, those loans had preserved stability. Unofficially, they had placed nearly every important decision under Richard's influence. Now the council insisted there was only one responsible solution. Ethan should marry Lady Victoria Hale, unite both houses, and secure the future of Westmoor. It sounded practical. It sounded honorable. It also sounded carefully planned long before Ethan ever returned home. "You do not trust them," James said quietly. Ethan finally turned toward him. "I trust that every person in that council believes they are acting for the good of the duchy. I simply disagree on whose future they are protecting." James hesitated before speaking again. "Lady Victoria is respected, educated. Many believe she would make an excellent duchess." Ethan walked toward the long oak table where official documents had already been prepared for the ceremony. The parchment describing the selection process read, less like the beginning of a marriage and more like the transfer of valuable property. Names, family histories, estates, dowries, political advantages. There was almost nothing about character, nothing about kindness, nothing about trust. Ethan rested one hand on the document before folding it closed. I spent 8 years watching men judged by courage instead of titles, he said. Now I return home and find women measured like investments. James studied his commander carefully. Then what will you do? Ethan smiled, although there was little joy behind it. I will refuse to play the game they have already decided I should win. His decision formed quietly during the remaining hours before sunset. He would not interview the candidates one by one. He would not reward rehearsed speeches or carefully arranged appearances. He would choose without looking. He convinced himself that such a choice would reject vanity and expose the emptiness of the entire ceremony. Yet somewhere beneath that conviction rested another assumption that he failed to recognize. He believed the woman standing at the end of the line, the one without wealth, influence, or powerful relatives, would ask for nothing beyond security. He mistook humility for simplicity before ever hearing her voice. Outside, bells announced that the guests had begun entering the great hall. James picked up Ethan's ceremonial cloak and placed it across his shoulders. Whatever happens today, James said, the court will remember it for generations. Ethan looked toward the towering doors leading to the ceremony and answered with quiet certainty. Then perhaps it is time they remembered something other than obedience. Neither man noticed Lord Richard Hale, standing silently in the shadow of a nearby corridor, listening just long enough to realize that the carefully arranged future of Westmoor had suddenly become far less certain than anyone had imagined. The great hall glowed beneath thousands of candle flames reflected across polished marble floors and towering stained glass windows. But beneath the beauty, every conversation carried the quiet tension of ambition. Noble families occupied their assigned places according to rank, while musicians performed with careful precision, their melodies drifting beneath vaulted ceilings carved with the history of Westmoor. Queen Eleanor observed everything from the raised platform beneath the royal crest, saying very little as members of the council whispered among themselves. Lord Richard Hale stood confidently beside his daughter, Lady Victoria, greeting influential guests with effortless charm. Years of political success had taught him that appearances often won victories before words were ever spoken. Victoria wore a deep blue gown embroidered with silver thread, her posture flawless and her smile practiced until it seemed almost permanent. She accepted compliments with graceful confidence because she believed this evening had already been decided long before anyone entered the hall. Every noble present expected Duke Ethan Whitmore to announce her name. Every carefully arranged detail pointed toward that conclusion. Clara Bennet remained near the back of the gathering, almost invisible beneath her weathered gray cloak. She stood quietly with both hands resting in front of her, saying nothing as curious eyes drifted toward the unfamiliar woman whose clothing looked painfully ordinary beside the silk and velvet surrounding her. A pair of young ladies glanced in her direction before lowering their voices just enough to pretend they were being polite. Perhaps she wandered into the wrong castle, one whispered. Another smiled. Or perhaps she hopes kindness is enough to replace a family name. Clara heard every word. She simply looked toward the stained glass windows where afternoon sunlight painted shifting colors across the floor. She had promised herself years ago that she would never allow another person's opinion to decide her own worth. Lord Richard slowly crossed the hall until he stood before the registration table. He examined the official list of candidates one final time, satisfied that Clara's name remained at the very bottom exactly where it belonged. Everything is prepared, he quietly told the chief steward. The ceremony must proceed without unnecessary distractions. The steward nodded without realizing Richard's attention lingered on one specific name much longer than the others. Across the room, Captain James Carter noticed Richard's unusual interest but remained silent. His instincts, sharpened through years of military service beside Ethan, warned him that something beneath the surface did not fit together. The castle bells rang once, announcing the arrival of the Duke. Every conversation ended immediately. Ethan entered wearing the ceremonial black coat of House Whitmore, its silver embroidery catching the candlelight as he walked toward the center of the hall. He acknowledged the Queen with a respectful bow before facing the assembled candidates. Instead of beginning the formal introductions prepared by the council, he calmly lifted the parchment containing every name. "Today," he announced, "I will not ask anyone to compete for my approval." A ripple of confusion spread through the audience. Several council members exchanged worried glances. Lady Victoria's confident smile faded almost imperceptibly. Ethan continued speaking with steady calm. "Character cannot be measured through rehearsed speeches, expensive clothing, or family reputation. If this ceremony is meant to reveal honesty, then honesty must begin with me." Without unfolding the parchment, he turned it face down on the table. The movement sent an uneasy silence across the hall. Richard's expression tightened. Queen Eleanor watched without interruption, her thoughtful eyes fixed upon Ethan. Slowly, Ethan extended one hand toward the list, sliding his finger downward until it reached the final entry. He never looked at the name. He simply rested his hand there. Richard suddenly took one involuntary step forward. Victoria's fingers tightened around the fabric of her gown. Captain James recognized genuine alarm crossing Richard's face for the first time that evening. Ethan drew a quiet breath, completely unaware that his next sentence would awaken secrets buried for more than 2 decades, while Clara, standing unnoticed beneath the shadow of her hood, gently closed her eyes as though she had been expecting this exact moment long before anyone else in the hall believed fate had chosen her. Silence settled over the great hall with a weight no one had expected. Duke Ethan Whitmore kept his hand resting on the final name without lifting the parchment, while every noble, merchant, advisor, and servant waited for him to change his mind. He did not. Instead, he looked toward the woman standing beneath the gray hood. "Please step forward," he said calmly. Clara Bennett obeyed without hesitation. Her footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor, steady and measured, never hurried by fear or slowed by doubt. As she approached the center of the hall, dozens of curious eyes followed every movement she made. Lady Victoria Hale folded her hands together, forcing a polite smile that barely concealed her disbelief. "Your Grace," she said, "perhaps the lady does not understand the honor you are offering. It would be unfortunate if this ceremony became a misunderstanding." Ethan answered without looking away from Clara. "The only misunderstanding would be assuming someone is unworthy before hearing a single word they have to say." Several members of the council shifted uneasily. Lord Richard Hale stepped forward with practiced confidence, offering a respectful bow toward the Queen before addressing Ethan. "Your Grace, the traditions of Westmoor exist for good reason. Every candidate must have her lineage verified before any formal declaration can be recognized." Queen Eleanor remained silent, allowing the exchange to continue. Richard turned toward Clara with the measured smile of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation. "Young lady, please present your family record." Clara slowly reached into her satchel and removed a neatly folded document. Richard accepted it, scanned the page, and frowned. "No noble house," he announced loudly enough for the hall to hear. "No recognized title. No living guardian of rank. No estate. No witnesses able to confirm your heritage." A quiet wave of murmurs rolled through the audience. Lady Victoria lowered her eyes as though disappointed rather than pleased. "Surely," she said softly, "the Duke deserves someone whose history can actually be verified." Clara remained perfectly composed. "My history exists," she replied. "Not all histories are written where powerful people choose to look." Richard folded the document and handed it back without another glance. "Your Grace, I strongly recommend that this candidate be removed until proper verification can be completed." Before Ethan could answer, one of the palace attendants approached Clara, intending to escort her away. She did not resist. She simply stepped aside to allow him room to pass. As she moved, the edge of her weathered cloak brushed lightly against the ceremonial sword hanging at her side. The sword shifted just enough for the silver emblem on its hilt to catch the candlelight. Captain James Carter noticed it first. His eyes narrowed. The crest had been worn nearly smooth by time, but one unmistakable crescent remained visible beneath the scratches. James had seen that symbol only once before inside an ancient history volume preserved in the castle library. Across the hall, Lord Richard noticed the same detail. His confidence disappeared for the briefest moment before he recovered his expression. It was only an instant, but Queen Eleanor saw it. So did Ethan. "Stop," the Queen said quietly. Her voice was gentle, Yet the entire hall obeyed immediately. She looked directly at Clara. "Where did you obtain that sword?" Clara rested one hand lightly on its hilt without drawing it. "It belonged to my mother," she answered. Richard responded almost too quickly. "Many old weapons carry forgotten markings. They prove nothing." Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward him for the first time since entering the hall. "Then why did your face change the moment you saw it?" No one spoke. The question lingered beneath the vaulted ceiling as though the castle itself expected an answer. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Queen Eleanor rose from her chair, descended the first step of the royal platform, and fixed her attention on the hood still covering Clara's face. "There is one more question that must be answered before this ceremony continues," she said. "Young lady, will you show this court who you truly are?" No one moved. No one even seemed willing to breathe. Queen Eleanor's request settled over the great hall like the final note of a bell echoing through ancient stone. Clara Bennet stood quietly at the center of the room, her hands resting at her sides while hundreds of eyes remained fixed upon the shadow cast by her gray hood. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she slowly looked around the hall. She saw noble families who had laughed only moments before. She saw servants pretending not to stare. She saw Lady Victoria Hale standing perfectly still, her confident smile replaced by uncertain silence. She saw Lord Richard Hale watching her with an expression that no longer resembled polite authority but careful calculation. Finally, her eyes met Duke Ethan Whitmore's. Unlike the others, he was not looking at her with curiosity alone. He was searching for understanding. Clara spoke softly, yet every word reached the farthest corners of the chamber. "For many years, I believed hiding my face would protect other people from dangerous questions. Today I understand that silence can protect lies just as easily." Her hands rose slowly toward the edge of her hood. The movement was unhurried, almost ceremonial, as though she were opening a door that had remained closed for decades. One candle flickered near the stained glass windows. Somewhere in the distance, the wind pressed gently against the castle walls. Then the hood slipped back. The room remained completely still. There was no disfigured face, no terrifying secret. Before them stood a young woman with calm gray eyes, chestnut hair falling neatly across her shoulders, and a narrow faded scar tracing gently along one side of her temple. The scar did not diminish her appearance. If anything, it gave her quiet dignity. The surprise spreading through the court had nothing to do with beauty. It came from recognition. Queen Eleanor's hand slowly rose to her mouth. Captain James Carter stared toward the enormous portrait hanging above the eastern fireplace, then back at Clara again. Several older members of the court followed his gaze. The resemblance was impossible to dismiss. The portrait depicted Princess Amelia Ashbourne, Queen Eleanor's younger sister, whose disappearance more than 2 decades earlier had become one of the kingdom's greatest unsolved tragedies. The same thoughtful eyes, the same gentle expression. Even the small crescent-shaped birthmark near the left ear appeared exactly where memory insisted it should be. A crystal glass slipped from one nobleman's hand and rolled harmlessly across the marble floor before coming to rest. No one reacted. Lady Victoria slowly stepped backward, unable to hide the uncertainty spreading across her face. Lord Richard's shoulders became visibly rigid. Ethan remained where he stood, but something inside him quietly shifted. He realized that every assumption he had formed about the hooded woman had collapsed within seconds. He had imagined poverty. He had imagined simplicity. He had imagined someone whose life could be understood at a glance. Instead, every answer revealed another question. Clara calmly reached into her satchel and removed the weathered wooden box she had carried since arriving at Westmoor. She opened it carefully before Queen Eleanor. Inside rested the worn silver ring, the folded embroidered handkerchief marked with the initials A, and the sealed letter tied with faded blue ribbon. "My mother asked me to place these into your Majesty's hands," Clara said quietly. Queen Eleanor accepted the box with trembling fingers. She recognized the embroidery before unfolding the cloth. She recognized the handwriting before breaking the seal. As her eyes moved across the first lines of the letter, the color slowly disappeared from her face. She looked toward Clara again, this time not with doubt, but with unmistakable sorrow. Then she turned toward Lord Richard Hale. "How long?" she asked with heartbreaking calm. "Have you known that she was alive?" The hall fell into an even deeper silence. Richard did not answer. For the first time in many years, the most powerful advisor in Westmoor appeared to have no prepared words, while everyone present realized that the ceremony had become something far greater than the selection of a duchess. It had become the beginning of a truth that someone had desperately hoped would never return. Lord Richard Hale did not answer the Queen's question. Instead, he lowered his eyes for only a fraction of a second before lifting his chin with the calm confidence that had carried him through decades inside the royal court. "Your Majesty," he said evenly, "I know only what every loyal servant of the crown knows. Princess Amelia disappeared many years ago, and this young woman bears an unfortunate resemblance to an old portrait. Resemblance is not proof." His words sounded reasonable, and several council members nodded in cautious agreement. Clara Bennet remained silent. She had expected denial long before she crossed the castle gates. Queen Eleanor unfolded the letter with deliberate care. The faded paper trembled slightly in her hands, not because of age, but because she recognized every curve of the handwriting before reading the first complete sentence. The hall waited as her eyes moved slowly across the page. When she finished, she closed her eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "This letter was written by my sister." A wave of astonishment swept through the gathering. Lady Victoria Hale immediately stepped forward. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, "forgive me, but handwriting can be copied. Stories can be invented. Anyone seeking influence would know how to exploit old grief." Her voice remained gentle, yet every carefully chosen word planted another seed of doubt. Ethan watched Clara instead of Victoria. He expected anger. He expected desperation. Instead, Clara stood with the same quiet composure she had carried from the moment she entered the hall. It was the stillness of someone who had spent years preparing for disbelief. Queen Eleanor looked toward Clara. "Did your mother tell you everything?" Clara slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. She told me only enough to survive. She believed the rest belonged to you." She reached into the wooden box once more and carefully removed a folded map, its edges worn from time. "She asked me never to open this. She said only the Queen would understand it." Eleanor accepted the map and unfolded it across a nearby table. Captain James stepped closer as candlelight revealed faded markings beneath the old ink. The drawing showed the Ashbourne estate exactly as it had existed decades earlier. Hidden beneath one corner was a second layer of parchment attached so carefully that it could easily be mistaken for reinforcement. The Queen gently separated the layers. A collection of official seals appeared beneath them. Every seal belonged to the royal treasury. Every signature carried legal authority. Ethan immediately recognized one name. The document recorded the transfer of Ashbourne lands following the disappearance of Princess Amelia. At the bottom appeared a witness signature bearing the name Richard Hale. The hall grew silent once again. Richard answered before anyone could accuse him. "I signed hundreds of records during those years. Administrative duty does not prove wrongdoing." His explanation sounded convincing until Captain James quietly pointed toward another detail. "Your Grace," he said to Ethan, "the date." Ethan leaned closer. The transfer had been approved 2 full days before the official announcement that Amelia had disappeared. No one spoke. No one needed to. The impossible sequence explained why Richard had reacted so quickly upon seeing the old sword. It explained why Clara's presence had unsettled him before she revealed her face. Lady Victoria stared at the document, then at her father. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the ceremony began, uncertainty replaced confidence. Richard noticed her hesitation and calmly placed one hand upon her shoulder. "Do not be frightened," he said quietly. "Old records are often incomplete." Clara finally broke her silence. "Then perhaps the royal archives are more complete." Every eye turned toward her. "My mother wrote about another ledger," she continued. "She believed it was hidden beneath the original Ashbourne council chamber. She said it recorded every payment made during the transfer of the estate." Queen Eleanor looked directly at Ethan. The Duke understood the significance immediately. If such a ledger still existed, it would not merely answer questions about Clara's identity. It could reveal how one of the kingdom's most powerful families had quietly built its influence over an entire generation. And for the first time since returning from war, Ethan realized that the greatest battle awaiting him would not be fought beyond the castle walls, but inside the history his own court had chosen to bury. Queen Eleanor wasted no time. Before another opinion could cloud the truth, she ordered the royal archives sealed and instructed Captain James Carter to gather the oldest records connected to the Ashbourne estate. No one protested openly, but the atmosphere inside the Great Hall had changed completely. The ceremony that had begun as a public selection for a duchess had become an inquiry into the kingdom's forgotten history. Servants hurried quietly through the corridors while council members whispered among themselves, uncertain which alliances would survive the evening. Duke Ethan Whitmore remained beside Clara Bennet, instead of returning to the elevated platform reserved for the ruler of Westmoor. It was a simple decision, yet everyone noticed it. He was no longer standing with tradition. He was standing beside the woman nearly everyone had dismissed only an hour earlier. Lady Victoria Hale watched the growing distance between her father and the rest of the court. For the first time in her life, the certainty that had always surrounded the Hale family began to disappear. She looked toward Clara with an expression that no longer carried ridicule, but uneasy reflection. "Did you know?" Ethan quietly asked Clara while the archives were being prepared. Clara answered honestly, "I knew there was a secret. I did not know its full shape. My mother believed that truth should be discovered with evidence, not anger." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. "When I chose you, I believed I was rejecting appearances." Clara turned toward him with calm understanding. "You rejected beauty contests," she replied softly, "but you still believed you understood me without asking who I was." Her words were not cruel. They carried no accusation beyond simple truth. Ethan accepted them without defense because he realized she was right. He had refused to judge her appearance, yet he had quietly judged her circumstances. He had assumed that a woman wearing worn boots and an old cloak must also carry a simple life. The realization humbled him more deeply than any public embarrassment could have. Before either of them spoke again, Captain James returned carrying a weathered wooden chest protected by iron bands. Two royal archivists followed closely behind. Queen Eleanor personally unlocked the chest with an old silver key that had remained in the possession of the crown for decades. Inside rested carefully preserved ledgers, land surveys, treasury reports, and council journals dating back more than 20 years. Dust rose gently into the candlelight as the first ledger was opened. The oldest archivist adjusted his spectacles and began reading aloud. Each entry described routine matters involving taxes, harvests, and repairs until one page caused him to pause. "Transfer of stewardship regarding the Ashbourne estate," he read slowly. "Authorized pending confirmation of the disappearance of Princess Amelia Ashbourne." The room became perfectly still. Ethan stepped closer. "Read the date." The archivist did. The authorization had been recorded 2 days before the Crown officially announced Amelia's disappearance. Quiet disbelief spread through the hall. Richard Hale immediately stepped forward. "Administrative documents are often prepared in advance," he argued with measured confidence. "That alone proves nothing." Before anyone could respond, the second archivist carefully removed another folded sheet hidden between the ledger pages. It was a treasury receipt listing payments issued to several regional officials responsible for supervising the transfer of Ashbourne lands. Every payment had been approved under emergency authority. At the bottom appeared a handwritten notation unlike the others. It read, "Complete the transition before public notice to prevent competing claims." Queen Eleanor slowly closed her eyes. Ethan stared at the document without speaking. Clara looked not at the page but at Richard, whose composed expression had finally begun to crack beneath the weight of evidence. Then an unexpected voice broke the silence. Lady Victoria stepped away from her father, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the Queen. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "there is something my father never intended anyone to remember. When I was a child, I once asked why one room in our estate remained permanently locked. He told me some histories were too dangerous to survive. I believed he was protecting our family. Now I fear he was protecting something else entirely." Every eye turned toward Richard once more, and for the first time since the ceremony began, even those who had defended him no longer looked certain that the story he had spent a generation telling the kingdom could withstand another single page of the truth. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Westmoor Castle, replacing the uncertainty of the previous evening with a quiet sense that history had finally chosen honesty over convenience. Queen Eleanor stood before the assembled court with every recovered record carefully arranged upon the long oak table. After hours of examination by the royal archivists, the conclusion could no longer be ignored. The documents confirmed that the Ashbourne estate had been transferred through decisions made before Princess Amelia's disappearance had ever been publicly announced. Although many people had participated in the administration of those events over the years, the records clearly showed that Lord Richard Hale had overseen actions that allowed one powerful family to benefit from information the rest of the kingdom did not possess. Queen Eleanor ordered that the disputed lands be restored according to the law and instructed an independent royal commission to review every remaining record with complete transparency. No one applauded. The moment was too important for celebration. It demanded reflection instead. Lord Richard lowered his head as royal officers escorted him from the chamber to await the commission's findings under the authority of the crown. Lady Victoria remained where she stood, tears filling her eyes as she accepted that privilege built upon hidden truth could never become lasting honor. She turned toward Clara Bennet and bowed with genuine humility. "I judged you before I knew you," she said quietly. "For that, I ask your forgiveness." Clara looked at her for several seconds before answering. Forgiveness begins when people choose honesty over pride. Today is only the beginning. Victoria nodded without expecting anything more. Across the hall, Duke Ethan Whitmore stepped toward Clara. The entire court watched, expecting another formal declaration, perhaps even the completion of the marriage ceremony that had started everything. Instead, Ethan removed the ceremonial ribbon that marked the selection and placed it gently upon the table. "When I chose you," he said, "I believed I was rejecting a tradition that valued appearance above character. I understand now that I still failed to see the person standing before me. I assumed your story instead of asking you to tell it. For that, I am sincerely sorry." Clara studied him carefully. His apology carried no excuses and no attempt to protect his pride. It was simply the truth. "Respect," she answered softly, "cannot begin with assumptions, even kind ones." Ethan nodded. "Then I will not ask for your answer today. I will ask only for the opportunity to earn your trust honestly." Queen Eleanor smiled for the first time since the ceremony had begun. "That," she said, "is how every worthy future should begin." 1 year later, the Ashbourne estate flourished once again. Schools reopened. Roads were repaired. Farmers paid fair taxes instead of impossible ones. Clara, now recognized as Lady Clara Ashbourne, governed with quiet wisdom, often walking among the villages without ceremony because she believed leadership should be seen as often as it was heard. Duke Ethan reformed the council by inviting respected merchants, teachers, veterans, and village representatives to advise the duchy alongside the nobility. Decisions became slower, but they also became fairer. On a warm spring afternoon, Ethan visited Ashbourne without royal guards or formal procession. He found Clara standing beneath flowering trees overlooking fields filled with new growth. She was not wearing the gray hood anymore, because she no longer needed to hide from the past. Ethan stopped a respectful distance away. "May I walk with you?" he asked. Clara smiled gently and extended her hand. "This time," she replied, "you looked before you asked." They walked forward together, not because a court had demanded it, not because tradition required it, but because mutual respect had replaced assumption. Long after the royal ceremony faded into memory, the people of Westmoor remembered a far greater lesson. A hood had never hidden the truth. Pride had. And the day the kingdom finally chose to see a person before judging a face, justice quietly found its way home.